Welcome to Anchors Away, a podcast for boaters. I'm your host, Matt O'Hara, owner of the Queen Boat Company Marina on Lake George and the Freedom Boat Club franchise on the same lake. We've been doing the boat club for quite a while now and have several years of marina ownership under our belt, offering full service department, ship store, fuel dock, storage, dock space, and all the marina amenities you would come to expect. Each episode features an in-depth conversation with a boating expert or industry leader talking about their life in boating and some of the exciting things they're working on in the marine industry. We cover boating tips, tricks, the latest in technology, and many other things boating. Our goal is to inspire you to get into boating if you're already a boater, to improve your boating experience, and if you used to be a boater, to get back into boating and stay on the water longer.
I love to mix in guests who may not be in the boating industry, but rather demonstrate to us what boating can enable. Stephen Ladd is an author and adventurer who certainly pushes the limits on where a boat can take you. In his mid-30s, Steve designed and built the 12-foot Squeak and rode and sailed her over 6,500 miles over a 3-year journey, chronicling it in his book, 3 Years in a 12-Foot Boat. Nearly 2 decades later, Steve teamed up with his now wife, Ginny, to spend 5 years on a 21-foot boat traveling from Florida down through the Western Caribbean, navigating the river systems of South America, getting married, having a baby in Brazil, and every other kind of adventure you can imagine in between. They covered over 18,000 miles via sail, rowing, and motor in some of the later stages, and visited almost 20 countries. Please enjoy as Steve and I discuss his vessel, his journey, and his book, The Five-Year Voyage.
Well, Stephen, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate your time, and it's good to see you on land and able to connect via technology. I really enjoyed the book. Julie sent it to me, and I think I just devoured it in about 3 days, and I've got 3 little kids and 2 kittens, and I'm running a marina leading into Memorial Day, so my time is not ample right now, and that just shows how interested I was in it to get through it in a couple days. One of the things I noticed is that you definitely come off as a true sailing expert, and I know that the boat and boating was more of a conduit to adventure travel than boating for the sake of pleasure boating itself. That said, you referenced buying your first boat at 18, and that was well before your 3-year and a 12-foot boat adventure. So you did have boating in your blood prior to taking these adventures. How did you decide to buy that first boat at 18? How did you learn to sail, and really all that comes with it? I mean, I was struck that to do this kind of trip, your ability to read wind, read weather, know when to do what, how to navigate, how to chart your course. I mean, these are expert things that you've picked up, and clearly you've got a knack for sailing, whether you believe yourself to be an expert boater or not.
I just had a very outdoorsy background. My parents were just every weekend during the summer would be hiking or camping or boating. My mom and dad didn't have a boat, but we had family friends who had boats. So we would go on boating trips in which there were 2 or 3 or 4 boats involved. And then each of us would be on somebody else's boat because we didn't have our own boat, but that wasn't slowing us down too much. And the wintertime, it would be skiing. So anyway, just outdoorsy. And then as I became adult, it was clear to me that boating is a really good, not the only way, but a really good way to do a lot of good adventures, because you can go where there's water and, close to where, down the shorelines, you can access a lot of places that you can't access on land, or you can access a lot of places on land by water better than any other way.
And it also struck me that Ginny, your wife, was, I think novice would be the only way to describe her going into this. How did you go about getting her up to speed and bringing her ability to the point where she could do these storm-filled crossings with you and have the capability to do all the things you needed your partner in crime to do?
It's a good point. You've noticed that she was a very willing participant, but uneducated in these matters. She had some experience with just outdoors things like hiking and camping. She was not a novice there. She knew how to pack and be prepared and generally. So she and I just always have had a good, easy relationship of teaching each other. Where I knew more, I teach her. Where she knows more, she teaches me. So in this regard, I knew more. She just absorbed what I taught her about what she had to do to be my mate in that little boat, and there was a lot for her to do. She was fully occupied.
Yeah, yeah, and you encountered, I mean, you Spanish speaking, Portuguese speaking, you were doing Rosetta Stones on the fly to try to understand different languages. Sailing itself is kind of a different language. Did she pick up pretty quickly what the boom and the mast and the mizzen and furl and unfurl and all those things meant?
Well, she was a fast learner. That reminds me of an occasion in which we were still fairly new into it. We had reached, I believe, Belize. We might have even still been in Florida, to tell the truth. So it was still really early. I think it was in Florida. And I said, well, Ginny, there's this book here that I forget which book it is. It's a maybe a Chapman's Piloting or something, not that one, but something sort of like that. That's really a textbook on things you should know in order to boat. And it says you do this and then you do this. And one of them was kind of more of an advanced maneuver, and it was to sail backwards. Well, that's something that most people don't do, and it's kind of a tricky thing. I still can't say that I really know how to sail backwards, but we were trying it. It said to do this and it said to do that, and we were kind of trying it. We're kind of sailing backwards, but it's not easy to sail backwards. And so I said, Jenny, let's see if you can do it by yourself. I was sitting on the right at the bow just to be able to observe but not participate, and she was in the cockpit in charge of all the lines, and she was trying to do it in that boat, which is a Sea Pearl. There are two masts. They are unstayed. They're freestanding masts. So there's two booms to be aware of. And a weird thing happened where one of the booms swirled around one way. Remember, there's no shroud, so the boom can come all the way around, and it backwinded one way, and the other one backwinded the other way. Some really weird constellation of what the sails were doing, something you're not supposed to ever into. Then along the way, and then a weird jibe occurred, and a boom caught her on her forehead and made a scratch, which how quickly you bleed there.
Mm-hmm.
That's you bleed a lot when you get a scratch on your forehead, and so her face was covered with blood, so it looked really bad, but it's really just a scratch. But she was so proud of that, she took a picture of her. She had me take a picture of her, and she posted it down on her blog. She was proud of that picture.
Good. It didn't scare her away.
Right.
And so you mentioned the Sea Pearl. Can you tell me a little more about the vessel? And I know it was named after your cat, which after getting kittens now that are 10 weeks old, I can relate to wanting to name it after that. But just tell us a little bit about the vessel itself.
Yeah, the Sea Pearl is really unique. It was really designed by one of the Herreshoffs, not the most famous, the son, not the father, but the son, Francis Herreshoff. And so it's a classic vessel, but that's got kind of classic old-fashioned lines, but it's different in that it was designed to be a tender for a larger sailing vessel. And so it was meant to be able to be rowed, small enough to be rowed, but big enough to sail with some speed. And it has a flat-ish bottom. It's almost flat. It has some flare, so it has some rocker is the correct term. If you put it on concrete surface, it'll rock a little bit like a rocking horse, but it won't rock it all sideways. It's flat transversely. But then the bilges are rounded. It does not have chines. It's actually got roundedness there. And so the combination of those factors is that it doesn't have very much stability. It's a tender boat. Maybe not too bad right at first. It has a significant amount of stability at first, but then that quickly goes away. So it is a tender boat, and it kind of has to be to do the types of things it's meant to do, to be able to pull it up in the case of a larger crew, you can pull it up on a beach. The Sea Pearl is an open boat, 21 feet long, about 600 pounds in weight, a very light boat, and it has one big open hold, I would call it. That is, it's partially decked, but has a huge hole in the middle, which is where you put all your stuff. So it's not an enclosed boat, it's an open boat. And then it also has a cockpit that's separate from the hold, and that cockpit has a cockpit floor. And it's two masts. The mizzen is forward of the steering station, so it's a ketch. The way of managing the sails is unique and really good. The sails furl by wrapping around the mast. Now the masts rotate simply because they're in sockets. You put them in a socket, and you just grab onto it with your hand, and you twist the mast around. And as you twist, it wraps. 1 360 is one wrap of the mainsail or the mizzen, as the case may be. And you can wrap the mainsail about 7 times, I think, before it's all wound up, and the mizzen maybe 5 times, something like that. So typically you'll reef maybe 2 in the main and 1 in the mizzen, something like that. We modified it substantially. We built a permanent hardcover cabin to cover up that hold. It wasn't very tall. It gave us enough headroom so that sitting on the floor of the boat, and remember it's flat transversely just sitting where the bottom's on the floor, we have sitting headroom. That's how tall the cabin was, and the cabin just took up that area. So we had a cabin that was about 8 feet long and averaging about 3 feet wide. And then we installed on the floor of that cabin some bins and tanks that allowed us to store goods and water, but with floorboards over the tops of them, so that in the case of a capsize, everything would be held steady. So all our water, food, and materials and everything are ballast. The boat is not ballasted, but we made it ballasted by virtue of how we stowed our gear. Then we added in the cockpit a sliding seat rowing station, because this is, at least at the beginning, an unpowered boat. And so to supplement the sails, and it's a moderately good sailing boat. It's not the fast, and it's not really very good to windward, but it's not bad. And so to supplement that, we put in a sliding seat rowing station. This is a station that slides back and forth, so you use the power of your legs, and it has long oars, like the standard oars that you see in like professional or competitive rowers, 9 foot and some inches long. But that whole setup, that's the rowing station, was removable and then mountable. So you only have it in place when you're using it, because it's in the way. It takes up the whole cockpit. So you're always putting it in place and then taking it down again. So that summarizes the boat. Only in the last 3 of the 5 years did we have a motor, and in those years we had a 2-horse Honda. That model is now a 2.5 horse, but it's the same model. It's the Honda 2 or 2.5 horse.
Well, I'm going to connect a couple thoughts here. The first is that aside from being a sailor and an adventurer, you also have to be kind of a handyman and a mechanic to get things through, adding a skeg, fixing motors, taking them apart, patching up cracks when you hit a dock wall, and all kinds of things. Throughout your journey, you had to be a Mr. Fix-It on top of everything else. But the second part of it is, and this kind of speaks to that other book I was talking about, where when you're doing these kind of journeys and you're making all these stops, there's just a community of people that are either cruisers themselves or that live around the ports that are able and willing to help and support, and just seems like this spirit of camaraderie among people that are doing these types of adventure. And so you were able to fix a lot yourself, and maybe you grew up fixing, or maybe you learned on the fly, but you also found a lot of help along the way, and a lot of people that turned out to be friends. And if you could just speak to kind of that community and who these people are that you're encountering along the way.
Well, when you're traveling, you any kind of that's out, especially if it's an unusual adventure, you capture the imaginations of the people that you meet, and you really meet a lot of people. You're like a magnet for people who sometimes might have wished that they could go on an adventure too. And so you're meeting a lot of people, which is real rewarding, and they'll help you if they can. When you're around other boaters, they might be boaters, and that's good, of course. They can help you in more specific ways. In parts of our voyage, we were around what you might call Western boaters, Americans or Europeans or something, who have kind of modern, sophisticated boats, and they helped us. And other times you'll be around local indigenous boaters who maybe just have a dugout canoe. They'd be willing to help too, but maybe they couldn't help as much. So in all cases, yeah, you can get a lot of help along the way.
You seem to have a good street smart sense of who to ask for help and how to negotiate for help, and who maybe not to ask for help. Is that something you just developed along the way as well, having that sixth sense of who to avoid, who to go towards, who's going to be a helping hand?
I really couldn't say how I got that, but I guess I do. I mean, I should admit that I have not been foolproof. I have been robbed at knife point 3 times, and they succeeded. They got my money. And I've been hit over the head and knocked unconscious once, and they got my money. So 4 times now, I failed. But I put myself out there, and most of the times I succeed. I do have a street smart, I guess. I sum up people and I try to avoid bad situations.
So that was would be one of the challenges along the way, but there was no shortage of challenges. I mean, stormy crossings sounded terrifying to me, even down to bugs and wildlife and the people with bad intent and government incompetency might be an okay word to use in some of the locations. Were there any challenges that stood out as the biggest challenge, and did fear ever enter the equation for you?
There's a lot of times when you have fear. Like one time I remember was we had come on into the mouth of a small river called the Rio Motagua, which is the border between Guatemala and Honduras, and we had to come into something because we can't sleep at sea. The boat is so bouncy; it has extreme bounciness in any kind of small waves, so it's very difficult to sleep. You need to get into some sort of shelter, and so the only thing there was the mouth of this river, which we came into, and that was of some difficulty. There's swells, and then those become breakers, and you have to get across what you might call the river bar, and then you get into this small river, and then this considered to be a crime-filled area. Honduras is bad that way. It's a lot of homicide and everything, and so we saw this little slough, a little dead end. It turned out to be dead end. We know it would be dead end, but a little pathway of water going in, and then we went in. This goes in about maybe 200 yards, and then it was just a dead end, and there was a bunch of kind of brush around us and some trees with birds on them and lots of wildlife, but we're kind of trapped there. But then well, hopefully nobody saw us, but then this boat came in. We hear them coming, outboard motor coming in. We're trapped. I had no gun. I pulled out what weapons I had, like a machete, and I had a spear, like a skin diving spear, and I just put them down so that whoever was coming could see them. And they kind of chug slowly in. I come into sight, and there's three men in this little boat, and they come right alongside, and they bump into us, and they hold on with their hands, so we're like eyeball to eyeball, 1 feet apart. And one of them's doing the talking, and I'm just kind of being brusque and saying, "We're sleeping here, and we don't need help." Then they backed off and they went away. But believe me, that was a moment of fear, because what could we do? We couldn't run away. We couldn't swim away, because it's all like jungly with stuff coming out of it. There's no way to swim through it, and we couldn't boat away. We were really penned in.
All in all, even with all that, it was clearly, a rewarding trip in a lot of ways. Can you just kind of paint a visual picture of one day or night you remember where you just kind of looked around and said, I wouldn't be anywhere else but here. There's birds chirping, there's sun setting, there's whatever that just kind of puts us in that mindset of why you were doing what you were doing.
Oh yeah, like the one that comes to mind there is we were in the rivers of South America, and part of the time there we're on the Rio Paraná, which is flowing through Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, and then the part that I'm referring to, I'm thinking about, was in Brazil. And they have these big dams, sort of like on the Missouri River, there are big dams. So you'll see in the United States, there's 3 or 4 really big reservoirs. It's the same thing down there. But they flow through rather unpopulated areas. It's not like wilderness jungle necessarily. It might be farmland. There's not a lot of people around. The reservoir has, of course, flooded whatever was there before to a certain height. And whatever was there before, of course, included contributory streams coming in. And wherever those were, that means there's a little bay going in. And you can always just, and maybe every kilometer or so, there'd be another, basically it's an inlet, that tapers off, and it might be, whatever, a half kilometer long or something. And they have swampiness around their edges. And you can just go in there, you tie into some tree or something, some inundated tree, and then there's just all sorts of wildlife there. Giant anteater, 7 feet long. We would see maybe one of those. The tracks of a tapir, Tapir. We never actually saw a tapir, but we saw their tracks. Some animals you see, sometimes you only see the tracks of them. And just beautiful. I mean, it's just like perfect weather, beautiful sunset. And you've got everything you need. You've got your water and your meal, and you've got your computer in which you've got an episode of Simpsons you can watch, and you have enough charge on your computer because you have a little solar panel that charges a little battery, which is able to make your computer last for another episode of The Simpsons. I even would have a musical instrument to play, and we just have each other's company. At that point, we had a baby too, so it was great.
Well, yeah, that was kind of bearing the lead there. So more props to Ginny for doing this trip as a novice and then completing an entire pregnancy throughout. What was that experience like?
Right. Well, after about maybe 4 months of being on the rivers of South America, as opposed to the saltwater portions of the trip where you're following coastlines or going from island to island and where you've got a lot of wave action and storms. And the rivers were much more sane. The rivers are typically not rough or rugged. They're typically smooth water. There really isn't that much storms really in the tropics. The tropics is actually an area of less storm activity. It's hot and there will be big rainstorms, but not big windstorms too much. So we just decided that although it was the most remote places of the voyage, we were in the most remote of the most remote parts of South America. We were in the back of the back of the back of beyond, because the river systems, it's not like North America. North America, the Mississippi goes right through the middle of the country, but it's very heavily populated. In South America, the big rivers go right through the middle of the continent, but they're not populated. The coastal areas are populated, but the middle is still kind of undeveloped. And the rivers are also where the countries meet. The rivers are usually the international boundaries. So we were in a very remote area, but we just decided that it was so safe that we could have a baby. We could begin the process. And so we conceived the baby intentionally. And when it came to term, we were where 4 countries come together: Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Brazil. All of them were welcoming to us in terms of having the baby there. And I let Ginny pick Brazil. She was just very, very positive about Brazil. She preferred Brazil. So we chose a hospital that she was able to research ahead of time. We knew which town we were going to try to get to, and that hospital had a town, and we could afford what they would charge. And when we got there to that town, we also arranged, well, first we had to stay on the boat for a couple of weeks to find this place, but then we found an apartment to stay in for 1 month. 2 weeks prior to the delivery, 2 weeks after the delivery. Then after that 2 weeks after the delivery, we resumed the voyage with the baby, and it all went well.
Yeah, I was amazed. I mean, it sounded like he just adapted to life on the boat and took right to it for the most part. And I loved one of the pictures that you had the caption of George entertaining locals. Seemed like some of the people he met along the way got a kick of a baby being on board too.
Yeah.
How did this trip, 5 years with a partner, compare to 3 years solo? Any major differences between doing it one way or the other?
Yeah, big difference and a big similarity. The similarity is that it's a small boat voyage, similar kind of locations. In fact, in the second book, we crossed the path of where we went in the first book once or twice. Anyway, they're both small boat voyage where the boat is just big enough for the number of people there. In 3 years in a 12-foot boat, 12-foot was just big enough for me. The 5-year voyage, the 21-foot boat was just big enough for the two of us. And so the physical aspect of the trips were very similar. The 5-year voyage was longer by quite a bit. We went all the way to Argentina and back. But the main difference was that the 3 years in a 12-foot boat was myself lonely, and therefore the writing emphasizes the loneliness and the angst and the personal feelings, dreams I might have, stuff like that. It's more, I would say, got some aspects of literature, whereas the second one is more straightforward, up front. It's positive. Because we're together, we're happy and upbeat. We're able to share both the goods and the bads. It's more of almost a photo documentary. Ginny being a photographer, we have a lot of pictures. It's more the bright side of things.
Yeah. Well, I want to wrap with one last question, and you give a lot of practical advice at the end of the book for anyone thinking about doing this trip in terms of even as minute as what to bring for medical and food and how you pack things, but more kind of big picture. If you were talking to someone who's considering a voyage like this and trying to satisfy this wanderlust feeling and not sure if it's for them or not, or, can I do this? What one piece of advice would you give someone just in that thinking phase of can we do this type of trip? Should we do this type of trip? Do we want to do this type of trip?
Well, certainly it would just be self-confidence. If you think you can, you probably can. If you think you can't, you probably can't. But emphasis on the positive. Try it. Try to think you can, and then probably you can.
Very well said. Well, good, Stephen. I really appreciate the time. I enjoyed the book. And maybe in 18 years, when you're probably closer to the next part of the 18-year cycle, we'll see where the next trip takes you, and maybe you'll have some kids doing it with you again.
Oh, that'd be nice. If they want to go, I would encourage it.
Well, thank you again. I really appreciate the time and great reading. Nice job.
Well, thanks for having me, Matt.
You got it.
Steve and Ginny truly accomplished something very unique in their voyage. I love how Steve describes the boat as being the only way to access so many of the remote destinations they found. Many people, on a smaller scale, find that boating is the only or best way to have certain experiences and derive a certain happiness, whether it's crazy adventure travel like the lads or even just casual boat day or fishing day with family and friends. Boats and boating, to me, stand alone as being able to instantly transport people to a different place and mentality, and Steve and Ginny have 5 years of proof of that. Until next time, happy boating.